wants to do it. There we go. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Joni Pini Fitzsimmons, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of my research that looks at food provisioning of rays and sharks for wildlife tourism. So to begin, a little bit about myself. I'm a marine scientist at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and I'm currently finishing up my PhD there in the next month or so, which is very exciting. And I've been working on Australian sharks and rays for the last 10 years or so, starting with these little guys down here, which is the Port Jackson shark, which is a small benthic shark that's endemic to Australia. And they're my first loves of the whole shark and ray world. They're quite little characters, so very much enjoy working with them. And after working on these ones, I started moving into studying rays, which are the flatter cousins of sharks. And now I'm working on these large stingrays called the smooth stingray. And my main research focus is looking at human-wildlife interactions and looking at the potential impacts on wildlife and making sure that these interactions that occur between people and wildlife are beneficial to both the people and the wildlife that they're interacting with. So as a little bit of an outline for today's talk, I'm first going to talk a little bit about the difference between sharks and rays, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what shark and ray tourism is and how it uses food provisioning, and have a bit of a chat about the benefits of shark and ray tourism, the potential impacts, and the importance of good management in these systems. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own research in this space. I'll introduce you to my study species, the sites that we study the animals at, the research questions that we're trying to answer, and our methods and our findings so far, and finish off with a little bit of a summary. So talking a little bit about the differences between sharks and rays, you wouldn't think looking at them that they were really closely related, but they're actually very closely related, and they have quite a few similarities that you just need to look a little bit closer to see. And one of the main ones is that the rays and the sharks are both cartilaginous fishes, which means that their skeletons are made of cartilage. So if you feel the top of your ear, it feels kind of bendy and wobbly, that's cartilage. And that's what their skeletons are made of. So both sharks and rays have these skeletons, and it means that they're very flexible and they can move around really quickly in the water. And sorry, you'll have to excuse, I've got my cat next to me who's trying to get her tail in my face. So for a couple of the other similarities between sharks and rays, you have to look a little bit closer again. Now, both groups have gills that are, for the sharks, they're on the side of the animals near their pectoral fins, but for the rays, they're sort of hidden underneath their bodies, right next to their mouths. Both groups also have skin that's covered in these tiny little scales called dermal denticles, which helps protect them from parasites and helps them move really smoothly through the water. And they also both have a special sixth sense called the ampullae of Lorenzini, which are a tiny organ that, well, a network of organs that are around their snouts and their mouths and underneath the disc for the rays that help them pick up the tiny electrical currents that are given off by the prey that they're looking for. And it means that they can see the prey without actually having to see them with their eyes, which is pretty cool. So, of course, they also have quite a lot of differences. Most notably is that the sharks have these torpedo-shaped fish, typical fish-shaped bodies, and they're powered by these really powerful tails. Whereas the rays are basically flattened versions of sharks. And instead of being long and cylindrical, they're flat and broad for swimming along the sea floor. And they're powered by their big, powerful wings as opposed to their tail pushing them through the water. So now that we know a little bit about their similarities and differences, let's have a little chat about the tourist attractions that target these animals. So sharks and rays are fascinating creatures, as I'm sure you all know, but they're also kind of elusive and shy, and it's not often that we get to see them in the wild in their natural environment because they are a little bit wary of humans. So this isn't great for tourism that targets these animals. If you can't see them, then you know your tourist operation probably isn't going to do too well. So what we do know about them is that a lot of their movements are driven by food, which is true for a lot of animals and even humans. If you think about your standard day, you wake up in the morning, you have breakfast, middle of the day you have lunch, end of the day you have dinner, and your day is sort of planned around those times when you're eating and when you need to eat. So sharks and rays are very much the same. They need to eat to survive. And so we know that they're very food motivated. And that's why a lot of tourism operations that focus on sharks and rays use food to help attract them into these areas where people are. And that's what food provisioning is. It's basically providing food to the animals. And in the context of tourism, it's to help elicit these encounters between us and the wildlife in their natural environments. So a couple of examples of this are down the bottom here. One of probably the better known examples is Stingray City in the Cayman Islands, where southern stingrays are fed by thousands of tourists every year. You can go there and swim with them, snorkel with them, dive them, and of course feed them as well. And you can see just how many stingrays there are that come in to be fed by people. Another example is whale shark feeding in Oslob in the Philippines. And these fishermen from these boats put in a whole bunch of bait fish into the water, and the big whale sharks come in and suck up all that tiny food. And you can see heaps of these sharks in these spots at any one time. And a third example is cage diving for sharks like great white sharks in places like South Africa, where they use big baits, big tuna heads and frames and things like that to entice these big predators in close to divers that are in these in the cages under the water, so they can see them up close and personal. So we do know that there are some benefits from feeding animals for things like tourism, and one of the main ones, which is really important for sharks and rays, is helping their conservation. So people, when they interact with these, you know, big fearsome predators in their natural environments, they can gain a greater appreciation for these animals than they otherwise would if they hadn't seen them for themselves. And so this helps us in conserving these animals because we want people to know about them, we want people to care about them. And it's particularly important for sharks and rays because they are really, really threatened. There's lots of things that are threatening their survival. So the more people that know about them and care about them, the more we can do to conserve them. So that's a really good benefit of these wildlife tourism operations. It can also help with survival. So the extra food that we're giving to them when they're being fed for tourism can help them to survive a little bit better. It just helps them eat a bit more and help that survival of them. And also it can help with their recovery. So a lot of these species, their populations are in decline, and adding a little bit more food into their diet can help them to reproduce more, make more babies, and help boost those population numbers. So there are definitely benefits of feeding animals, particularly threatened animals. But there are some impacts as well. And some of the major ones that we do see are behavioral changes. So you can see from this video at the top here, this large stingray coming up this ramp. This isn't a normal behavior for a stingray to do in the wild. They wouldn't be using all that energy to push themselves out of the water. And the reason that this one's doing it is to be fed by this person here that's got little chunks of fish that it's feeding to it. So we do see changes in like individual behaviors like this. We also see changes in movement patterns where animals are, instead of moving around and hunting in the environments that they're supposed to be hunting in, they instead put all their energy into coming into these locations where they're getting fed, because they don't have to use as much energy to catch the food because it's not trying to swim away from them. We do also see that there is increased stress particularly in areas where the animals are crowded around with a lot of people. Like you can see here, all these stingrays that are coming in to get fed, and all these people that are crowding around these animals, which can be quite stressful. People coming in and touching them and handling them, it can cause stress. And it can also lead to increased disease transmission. So these animals often live sort of on their own. They don't really come into contact with other animals of their species very often. And so disease doesn't really travel around too much. But when they're forced to come into close contact with all these other animals, diseases can pass really quickly through each individual animal in that population, which can be really, really bad and cause population declines if it's bad enough. There's also risks of injuries, both to the animals and to people. So where these animals are being fed, it's often from boats like these ones here, which can cause the animals to accidentally come into contact with propellers and things like that and cause damage to them. It can possibly kill them. People handling them and touching them and feeding them can also cause injuries to their skin, because they've got very sensitive skin and slime coat that's covering their skin. And if that gets damaged, it can cause parasites to get in and things like that as well. And there's of course risks to people, especially with feeding sharks and rays, because they are wild predators. They can be unpredictable, and accidents do happen where people unfortunately do get bit or stung by the barb of stingrays, for example. So there are risks to people as well. And there's some issues with the types of food and the amount of food that they're getting fed in these situations. So if they're getting fed the wrong kinds of food, they might not have the right nutrient balance that they need for survival. And it could be that they're getting too much food. So if they're not swimming around and hunting naturally, where the fish sometimes hard to catch and there aren't fish everywhere, and you know they get as much as they need from hunting, but when they're getting food handed to them and fed to them, they don't have to swim around and hunt it, and they can eat a lot more of it, which can mean that they're eating too much food, and it could potentially result in them relying on these foods as well, which is a risk, because if they do become reliant on the food that they're getting fed, they can potentially lose the ability to hunt for themselves. And if the feeding stops, then the animals might die because they've forgotten how to hunt for their food naturally. But these impacts are all a little bit scary, but there is some good news. So what we know is that when there are rules put in place, so good management practices, that's making sure that the animals are being fed the right foods in the right amounts, and that people are behaving in ways that are not hurting or stressing the animals, then the impacts can be reduced. So if we take a little look at this picture here, what the colours mean is the risk level for a whole bunch of different things that are involved with wildlife tourism for sharks and rays. And the darker the orange colour, the higher the risk is. So in the first column, we have cage diving, which has some things that are high risk, some very high risk activities. In diving, we have a little bit of that sort of high level risk as well. In food provisioning, we have lots of high risk and some of the very high risk factors. And in snorkeling, there is still a bit of that medium coloured orange, which is high risk. And this is in situations that aren't managed. So there's no rules in place. This is just people engaging with these animals without any sort of guidance on how they should be interacting with them. But when we incorporate management into these situations, we see that these risks are really reduced. So all that darker orange colour, a lot of it has gone to lighter orange, medium and low risk level, especially with cage diving, and snorkeling. All those risk factors are really, really reduced. We do see that there is some risk reduction in food provisioning tourism, but it's not nearly as good as we'd hope. We want it to have a lot more of this low risk and no risk score in here, as we see in the other types of wildlife tourism for sharks and rays, but we do still see a little bit of that high risk in there. And what this means is that we probably don't have enough understanding of the potential impacts to be able to create the good and effective management that we need to properly manage these interactions so that those risks are really reduced. So that's a little bit about where my research comes in. So I actually study these situations where there's no management or rules in place, where these animals are being fed and interacted with, and there's nothing that's telling people how to behave and how their actions are potentially impacting the animals that they're interacting with. So in Australia, a really common example of unmanaged shark and ray feeding is from recreational fishing. So in Australia, as well as around the world as well, fishermen and fisherwomen go out for their day of fishing and they catch their fish, come back to the boat ramp, and there's usually these fish cleaning tables that are built right on the water's edge. And it's a really common practice to clean and gut their fish and throw the scraps into the water, where it's fed on by a whole bunch of different animals. We can see here, for example, some seabirds, seagulls, and things like that. There's lots of fish in the water they're feeding. Of course, there's a seal here that's hoping that he's going to get one of the fisherman's fish. And we also see big stingrays, like these smooth stingrays, especially in Australia, around southern Australia. Smooth stingrays are one of the most common scavengers of fishing waste that's thrown in at locations like this. And what happens in a lot of these situations is that members of the public see that there's these big charismatic animals coming in really close to where the people are, and they start feeding the animals themselves. And they'll start coming down with bags of bait or getting fish off fishermen and going in and hand feeding the stingrays. And in these situations, there's absolutely no rules that are put in place to teach people how to interact with these animals. And especially for large stingrays like these ones here in Hamlin Bay in Western Australia, there is a bit of a risk because they do have big stinging barbs in their tail. If people accidentally step on them or scare them or stress them out too much, they can be injured and it can possibly be fatal. So there are a lot of risks involved in this sort of feeding of wildlife where it's not being managed. So going into what my research entails is these situations where these large stingrays, which are known as the smooth stingray, come in to feed on fish scraps and where they're being fed by the public where it's not being managed. And so the smooth stingrays are a really cool stingray species. Their scientific name is Bathytoschia brevicordata. The species name brevicordata actually means short tail. So their other common name is actually short tail because their tail is a little bit shorter than their disc length. They're a coastal species found in the coastal waters of southern Australia, all around New Zealand and off the southern tip of Africa as well. And they're really, really big. So they're actually one of the biggest marine stingrays in the world. And they're so big that you can actually see them from space. So this is a Google Earth image of a place in southeastern Australia where we can see a smooth stingray that's been captured on photos from a satellite up in space. And we can see a couple of people standing in the water here that are actually there to feed this stingray. And so I think that's pretty cool. They're absolutely huge, about 2.5 meters wide or about 8 feet wide. So much larger than a human, than most people are tall. And the other really cool thing about these guys is they're actually identifiable by their dot patterns. So these dot patterns on their wings and around their eyes are actually as unique as your fingerprint. So we can actually look at the patterns in these dots and identify which ray it was, and they seem to stay the same throughout their life. So we can use them to figure out who's who when we see photos and see them in the wild, which is pretty cool. So where I do my research is a beautiful spot on the southeastern coast of Australia in a place called Jervis Bay. And here we have 3 different sites that I do research at. The first site is what we call a control site. And a control site is an area where you have animals that that aren't experiencing the impacts that you're studying, or aren't experiencing the context that you're studying. So in our situation, where this is our location where we have stingrays that aren't being fed, like this is a male here swimming past, a male smooth stingray swimming past our camera. And here at this particular boat ramp, we don't have any food going in the water. The animals aren't being fed. And so this gives us a baseline to compare this gives us an idea of what their natural behaviours are when we're having a look at the potential impacts of feeding. We can compare the movements and activities of the non-fed rays with the fed rays and see if there is a difference. Our second site is a site where the stingrays are fed just fish scraps that are thrown into the water. So in the top corner here, there's a fish cleaning table and a pipe here where the fish scraps are thrown into the water. And fishermen and fisherwomen women throw fish scraps into the boat ramp here as well. And as you can see, lots of big smooth stingrays use these sites, use this particular site to feed on these fish scraps. So this is one of our fed populations of stingrays that we're looking for potential changes in behaviour compared to those stingrays from the control site. And the third site is a site that is one of those unmanaged tourist attractions. So we have here, this is one of our stingrays that we know affectionately as Ziggy. And she's here getting hand-fed some fish scraps by a tourist in the water here. And during summer, we have hundreds of people coming down and coming down specifically to feed these stingrays, all without any management in place. So we want to have a look at how these animals move around compared to, again, those ones that aren't being fed. So using stingrays from these sites, there's a couple of questions that we want to know to figure out what sort of impacts that they're experiencing, or what potential impacts they're experiencing from the feeding activity. So the first thing is to figure out which rays are actually using the sites, and whether it's males or females or adults or juveniles or a mixture, just to give us an idea of what sort of animals are being impacted if there are impacts occurring. The second question we want to know is when the rays are using these sites. So if there aren't really any impacts, we probably wouldn't expect to see the rays using the sites at any specific time of day. We don't expect them to be doing much that's different to the stingrays that aren't being fed. But if there are impacts, we probably expect the fed rays to be turning up during the times when feeding is happening, or more so when that feeding is happening. And the third thing that we want to know is how far the stingrays are travelling. So we want to know whether the fed and the non-fed rays are actually moving around the same amount and using the same sort of areas as each other. And if they are using the same sort of areas and moving around the same amount, there probably isn't too many impacts that they're experiencing, at least to their broad scale movements and broad scale behaviours. But if we do see a reduction in the movements of the fed rays, for example, then we know that there are potentially some impacts to their movement behaviour as well. So we know what we want to know. How do we find out the answers? So for this, we use something called passive acoustic telemetry, which is a fancy way of saying tagging the stingrays and tracking their movements. And to do this, we tag our stingrays with this little contraption here, which is a little acoustic transmitter, or a tag, which is this bit here, and a little dart head that just goes into the muscle in the wing. And these tags make a little pinging sound, and we set up these listening stations for these tags all over the place so that we can track their movements. And whenever a stingray with a tag swims within range of one, or swims past one of these listening stations, we get data on which animal it was, when it was there, and where it was. And because we have these listening stations set up all over the place, we can link all the data together and track the movements of these animals around those areas that we're interested in. And here's a little video of just how we actually tag the stingray. So this is me tagging a large female smooth stingray. So I've got a tagging pole with the tag on the end of the pole, and it just goes into the wing. It's a little pinch for the ray. They dart off a little bit. It hurts a tiny bit, but it doesn't cause any lasting issues and they recover very quickly. It's kind of like getting a shot in the arm or a vaccine or something, a tiny little pinch, and then they go back to normal. And now that tag will stay in that stingray for about 6 months. After that, it falls out, and the stingray goes on its way. But during that 6-month period, we get lots and lots of data on where this animal is going and where it's moving and the areas that it's using. So what we did was tag a whole bunch of stingrays from all these different sites, and started tracking their movements. And so what we've found so far, in particular, which rays are using the sites, what we've actually found is really interesting. We find that it's only adult female smooth stingrays that use the sites where they're getting fed. We don't ever see males coming into these sites, and if we do see them cruising past, they don't actually come in and feed on any of the food that's going into the water. So we're not entirely sure why this is the case. We don't know why it's just the females that are coming in to get fed, but it could be to do with the fact that the female smooth stingray is about twice the size of the males. So they're a lot bigger, they require a lot more energy just to survive. So the fact that there's this easy meal that they can get fed to them without having to spend the energy to hunt means that they can get a lot more energy in without putting too much energy out. So it could just be because they have those higher energetic demands, supplementing their diets with this free food helps them to grow and sustain a lot easier. But regardless of the reason, because we're only speculating that reason, regardless of the reason, it's important to understand which rays are using these sites, especially if it's only the females or only part of a population. Because if there are any impacts that we see, it's only affecting a subset of the population. And in these cases where it's just the females coming in, because the females are responsible for carrying the pups and reproducing and making sure that that next generation is there to grow up and keep these stingrays in our oceans, if there are impacts that might affect their reproduction because it's only the females getting fed, then it's important to know that it's just the females and the males aren't being impacted, so that we can make sure that those potential impacts are managed as well. So for our second question of when the stingrays are using the sites, so we know that where the stingrays are being fed, the feeding tends to occur in the middle of the day, between the middle of the day and dusk. So between about 12 and 6 o'clock during the day. And at the control site where we have no feeding, this is the trend that we expect to see if there's no impact in the fed rays. We expect to see the same sort of thing as the rays at the control site, which we find to sort of be around a little bit more during the day and not so much during the night, but it's relatively even. But yeah, they are there a little bit more in the day, a little bit less at night. And if the fed rays aren't being impacted and they sort of just feed when the food's around, if they're there, and they're not really focusing their efforts on the feeding that's occurring at the sites where they're getting fed, we'd sort of expect them to do the same sort of trend. But what we actually see is a massive peak in their use of the feeding sites in this afternoon period when this feeding is happening. And what this tells us is that there's this fine scale shift in the movements and behavior of the fed stingrays compared to the control or non-fed stingrays. So we see that the control stingrays, this sort of really, this small sort of trend of more during the day compared to the fed stingrays, which is this massive peak in the afternoon of when they're using these sites, which is this clear shift in behavior, in their fine scale behavior, which isn't a very good thing. That is showing us that they are definitely being influenced by the feeding that is occurring. But it could be that, these sort of daily changes in behavior might be occurring, but their broader movements might not be impacted. They might still be moving around plenty and using areas that they normally would and hunting naturally and all those sorts of things. So we can have a look at exactly how far they're traveling and how much space they're using. Whoops. So when we have a look at the stingrays from the site where they're not getting fed, we see that they are moving around quite a bit. They're using lots of this western part of the bay here, moving around a lot, probably hunting and things like that. And so if the fed rays were still behaving quite naturally, you know, away from their feeding sites, then we'd expect them to be moving around about the same amount. But when we actually look at how much they're moving, we can see that they're moving around a lot less compared to the ones that aren't being fed. So this site here, or these ones here, are from the site where they're just feeding on the fish scraps. And we can see that they're pretty much just using the creek where the boat ramp is, a little bit of the bay, but they're not actually moving around a whole lot. And when we have a look at the site where they're getting fed by tourists, we see that they're moving around a whole lot less as well. So this is just a zoomed in bit of the beach where they get fed down here, and they're really not moving around all that much. And this could mean that the stingrays that are being fed aren't still hunting naturally, or at least not as much, and they're not moving around as much, which is showing us that there is definitely an influence of the feeding that's happening, and it is potentially causing impacts to their movements. So just to sum up a little bit about those findings, the first thing that we found was that we only have adult females coming into the sites where they're getting fed, and this can cause problems for reproduction, for example, because the females are responsible for, you know, having lots of pups and producing the next generation of these animals. We find that there are these fine-scale daily behavioural changes, these shifts from being around a little bit more during the day to these peaks in their detections or their visits to these sites, the feeding sites, in that afternoon period when the feeding is happening. And we also see those broader behavioural changes as well, being that the fed stingrays aren't moving around nearly as much as the non-fed stingrays, which is another indication that there are definitely impacts to their behaviours and their natural movements. So this is a good case for needing management implemented in these situations. And management doesn't have to be anything drastic. It doesn't have to be the immediate banning of feeding. It just means that we need to pay a little bit closer attention to how we're interacting with these animals. And it can be simple things like putting up signage down at the tourist sites, explaining what the potential impacts are, and educating people so that they can make their own decisions whether they want to feed these animals or not, and at least provide the information to them of how they should be interacting with these animals if they do choose to go in there and feed them. Or it could be employing staff members to come down and just oversee the feeding that's happening and make sure that there's not too many people and that they're not overhandling the animals or touching them or stressing them out, and just make sure that they're behaving in the correct ways. But all in all, what we need is a lot more research, especially in these situations where sharks and rays are getting fed, because there's a lot that we don't actually understand. And this work that I've done is really just scratching the surface in these unmanaged situations. So we do need to be doing a lot more research. And it's also important to remember that sharks and rays, they're wild animals that have existed for millions and millions of years. And they should be respected, and we should be looking after them to make sure that we can actually enjoy these animals for years to come. So that's about it from me. There's a few people that I'd like to thank, a few organisations, especially my university and DPI and all of our funding organisations that helps to fund my research and lets me do my research. And if you do want to follow any of the research and things like that on social media, all those links are there. And yeah, if you do have any questions, I've got time for some now too. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that great talk. If anyone has any questions, you can use the question and answer box that's on the bottom screen part. And I have a couple of questions in the meantime. So
Yeah.
you're gonna continue your research in any way?
Yeah. So I'm hoping that we can continue to do this sort of stuff. As I said, we're really just scratching the surface. So there's a lot more that we want to do and a lot more that we want to know. So hopefully moving forward, we get to do a little bit more tagging and tracking, and look at a couple of different situations as well and different sites that we can compare to.
Cool. So how can tourists and people interested in having these interactions with animals make sure they're kind of engaging in these well-managed experiences, like you're saying?
Yeah, well, there's heaps of information online where you can find out the more reputable tourist operations, the ones that have really clear guidelines on how people and the animals should be interacting. They should have those sorts of rules freely available on their websites so that you can actually read and make sure you know that you're going with someone that actually behaves in the right way and is treating these animals the right way.
Cool. And I think we have a question from AJ. So they say, with this research, what else are you hoping to learn about the project?
Wow, there's so many things that we don't know. So every day we get new little surprises, like when we found out that it was only females using these sites and things like that. So every day we're learning something new. We're doing some research that actually looks at their diet with a technology that's called stable isotope analysis. And that's based on basically you are what you eat. And we take little samples of their skin and their muscle, and we can look at exactly what they've been eating, and we can see just how much of their food is coming from these areas where they're getting fed food, where they're getting hand fed by people and things like that, compared to how much of their diet is actually natural. And that's going to give us an idea of how much they're actually still going out and hunting naturally, or if all of their diet is coming from these locations where they're getting hand fed. So that's something really interesting that I'm looking forward to learning a bit more about soon.
Cool. Do you have any advice for people who would be interested in pursuing kind of marine science research in the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many opportunities. If you're old enough, volunteering in research labs is a really good way to get experience and figure out exactly what sort of marine research you want to be doing. But the best advice I can probably give is just read and read and read. Read lots of information, get lots of books, read some scientific papers, and just learn as much as you can, because knowledge is power. And once you sort of find your niche or what you want to work in marine science, if you do want to go into marine science, then you're going to have a really good idea of what to expect and what sort of avenues you want to go down and what's available to you as well.
That's a good segue for the next question from AJ. Is there a way to read kind of live updates on your research, and are there any publishings to look out for or articles?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of papers published. You can search through Google Scholar. You can look up my last name, which is Pini Fitzsimmons, which I think it should be in the title of the talk online. And if you look up my last name in Google Scholar, that'll bring up our couple of papers that we've published. We actually had one come out a couple of weeks ago, which was all about the social behaviour of these stingrays, which is really exciting. And so that's up there now for you to have a read off if you want to read about it. But mostly the updates for this research are mostly through social media, which those links are here on this slide. If you wanted to follow any of those, that's where most of the updates get put.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for a great talk. And for everyone watching, thank you for participating. And we'll be posting this on YouTube if you guys want to go back and have everything. And then, yeah, we'll post it with the name so you can look at any articles related to this, as well as all the social media links. So yeah, thanks again so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all learned something.
Definitely. All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks, Michaela.